Welcome to a Rice University digital media production. For more information about us, please visit our website at www.rice.edu.
I want to welcome you all to this panel discussion on the Deepwater Horizon disaster. I'm Susan McIntosh, Director of Scientia, and I'm just really pleased to see such a large turnout for this event. As we were in the process of putting together this year's Scientia lecture series on the topic of failure, it became clear that the Deepwater oil well failure was already on its way to becoming one of the canonical examples of systems, complex systems failure in our time. And it was going to require more than a lecture to cover the multiple levels of technological and human error that were involved in this disaster. And I'm very grateful to Dick Grandy for suggesting a panel on the topic and then putting it together. I'm now going to turn the podium over to him, and he will introduce the speakers today.
Thank you, Susan. As Susan said, we had decided on a topic of failure for Scientia this year, and it seemed to me this was too good a failure to waste. So I organized this. I'm very grateful to the panelists, each of whom are contributing a great deal of expertise and who are going to operate on very serious time constraints. My conception, very briefly, of what we're doing today is to progress from a discussion of some of the technical aspects of the failure, which is going to be addressed by Professor Nagarajaiah from Civil and Mechanical Engineering, to implications for society and individuals. Professor Klineberg of Sociology, you probably know his Houston surveys, is going to talk about that, how people feel about this disaster when they go to the gas pump or to their seafood restaurant. We're then going to move to slightly broader issues of policy, energy policy, policy making. For that, we have Professor Amy Jaffe from the Baker Institute, who's going to address those issues. We're then going to move to a slightly more theoretical plane and discuss issues of rationality and choice in our planning and acting out on energy policies. Professor Peter Hartley of Economics will speak on that. And our final speaker is Professor Simon Grant, also of Economics, who will try to shed some light on the ways in which decision-making does, should, and perhaps might occur in the future. So we're moving from the specific event to much more general considerations. I hope you will find this thought-provoking. I know we have a great deal of expertise here, and I'm hoping that we will think not just about this issue, but about how, in general, we cope with regulation of very risky and very important technology in a democratic society. So just to repeat, we're going in reverse alphabetical order. Professor Nagarajaiah, Professor Klineberg, Jaffe, Hartley, and Grant. Thank you.
Thank you for the nice introduction, and I'm going to use my time, 10 minutes. I've been given 10 minutes, so I need to be quick on because I have a number of slides. So this is the Deepwater Horizon rig, which was on site, which was drilling when the accident took place. To introduce myself, I'm Satish Nagarajaiah, and I'm a professor in civil and mechanical engineering. On April 20th, approximately at 10 p.m., the disaster started. The blowout, the initial explosion due to the gas and mud surge, ignition upon entry into the engine room is what started this event. The fire started, the power failure occurred, and then there were violent vibrations on the Horizon platform, and then the second explosion occurred. Then they started evacuating the rig, and there was rescue from the nearby vessels. So this is a few pictures of the disaster. You can see the magnitude of the event. It was, just to give you a rough idea, this rig is about roughly from the ocean surface to the top there about 200 meters, and you can see how tall the flames were actually. The gas, which was gas and oil, which is coming up, was going up to quite a height. You can see almost 2 to 3 times the height of the vessel there. And here are the rescue vessels which were trying to put out the fire. Of course, it was impossible to put it out on. So it went down approximately 2 days after the event began. So let me start by giving an introduction to what these offshore structures are. So this is the ocean surface. You have a rig there. That's the drill rig, which has a drill derrick there. And they have drill bits which actually go down from that. And you have a pipe, which is called a riser. In this case, it was 21 inches in diameter. And the drill pipe actually goes inside the riser. And all the drill mud, everything is within the, goes within the riser. And then the riser connects to a valve, which is called the BOP stack, which is the famous blowout preventer. You will have heard about this over and over again. And the ocean surface was at ocean bed was 5,000 feet. And then another 13,000 feet was the well depth, actually. From the wellhead to the reservoir was about 13,000 feet. And this is a schematic of the whole system after the collapse, and you can see that the horizon rig is there. This is the riser, which has collapsed, and then oil is leaking here, and there are vessels here with remotely operated vehicles trying to shut down the BOP and so on. And it also shows a relief well, which came much later on. And this is the well which goes all the way down 13,000 feet from the ocean bed to the reservoir. So the reservoir is tapped, and oil comes up the well and onto the riser, and when it was intact, the intent was the oil was supposed to come up, and then they would pump it out. So that's the schematic of this system. This actually shows the well design. You can think of this well as follows. As I told you, the riser is 21 inches, and then it reaches the BOP, and then you have well casing, which protects the well inside of the well all the way from the ocean floor to the reservoir. It's 13,000 feet. And think of this as a telescopic tube, which is inverted. So you have the smallest diameter, largest diameter up here, and then the smallest one down here. And the way they do it is they start drilling here. They drill the hole, insert the first well casing, and then telescope each one of them sequentially down, and then introduce the production casing, which is the innermost one, which is about 7 inches in diameter. That's the production casing through which the oil and gas is supposed to come up. And the drill bit is actually inside that production casing. So the pressure, formation pressure comes from below here. The formation pressure in this case was approximately about 12 to 13,000 psi. And that pressure is tremendous pressure. And that's overcome essentially by the mud. That's the drill mud which is in the pipe. So that drill mud actually neutralizes this formation pressure. That's called the primary barrier. Okay, that's what is used to prevent the formation pressure from coming up. The well casing is actually sealed all along. As you go down, if you see here, I don't know whether you can see each well casing is sealed with some cement, and that cement is actually sequentially introduced as the well is drilled down towards the reservoir here. And there is a sequence of introducing a bottom plug, top plug here, and forcing the cement through, and then forcing the cement to come out around the casing. And that is what closes the gap between the formation and the casing, and then that seals the casing in place. So the well control, the barriers are two. There's primary barrier and secondary barrier. And as I said, the mud in the well is simple static equilibrium is what is used to prevent the formation pressure from coming up. That's the downward weight of the mud, drill mud, which is in the well. And then also some well design. There are a series of wells which prevent the formation pressure, gas and oil from surging up, and I'll explain that a little more. And the secondary barrier is this blowout preventer, and that is the valve of last resort. So this is the blowout preventer. It's about 40 feet tall, 500 ton in weight. It's 5 stories tall. It's a series of stacks, series of valves here, stacked one on top of the other. And the final valve is called the blind shear ram, which the basic idea of the blind shear ram is if it is turned on, it basically is supposed to completely cut the pipe and shut off the well. That's the idea, okay? So it never did that in this case. So that's the valve of last resort. In this case, it did not work. Here is a schematic of the whole thing. This is the drill pipe going inside the blind shear ram, and these are the rams which ram it, literally cutting the pipe. So to give you an idea, so this is the drill rig. You have mud, overcoming the formation pressure here. So they were in control on the 19th, okay? So they were in equilibrium, static equilibrium. There's no dynamics here, simple static equilibrium. The weight of the mud neutralizes the formation pressure. That's, approximately, as I said, about 12,000 to 13,000 PSI down here. So a series of things happened. They started cementing the day before the last set of cementing down here, and they were waiting to perform a series of tests to check whether that cement is holding, and that's when the trouble started. Okay, so the first thing that happened was we suspect the cement casing cementing here, failed here, and then the methane gas bubble and oil started rushing up on the side, the gap which is there between the production casing, which is inside this well. The gap is called the annular space. So the gas and oil started surging up. We also suspect that there may have been a failure of this plug, lower plug within the production casing. There may have been some leak from here also. BP, at least in their internal investigation, say that there may have been a compromise of this plug also. We don't know for sure. So then once this happened, once the pressure reached the wellhead, that's the ocean surface, or rather the ocean floor here, there is a seal called a lockdown sleeve, which is supposed to hold the formation or the pressure down. That failed. And then, of course, on top of that is the BOP, which is supposed to be activated in case this happens. And they did activate it, but it did not work. So here is what happened. So pressure came up all the way here, BOP fails, and then, of course, it came up all the way, leaked into the engine room, and then the fire started. So the sequence of events are shown here. The well system failure, we suspect that the cement plug failed, the wellhead seal failed, well control failure. This is the key step which really resulted in the failure. What they did was they, just a few hours before the disaster, they started removing the mud, which is holding the pressure down, started displacing that with seawater. The weight of the mud is roughly twice the weight of the seawater. So essentially, they were neutralizing they were taking away the overburden pressure, which was holding down the formation pressure, and that they lost the primary barrier there. That's when mud started coming up, and it actually literally was oozing out of the well. People who are on the side of the vessel noticed this, and they did notice that there was something wrong. And then once they realized on the rig floor, they started, they triggered the blowout preventer, which did not hold. So that led to the explosion and so on. So, they were supposed to do a final test, which is called a negative test, which is supposed to tell us whether the well was under control or not. The negative test actually was not done properly, and the test was done improperly, and they got inconclusive results from this test. And they misread these tests because they should have actually gone back and redid the test. They never did that. And then, of course, once that happened, they started displacing the mud with seawater. And then, of course, once the pressure was neutralized, the gas bubbles started coming up. And then, no mechanical bridge plug, no cement plug, no annular seal hold down. The blowout preventer fails, and then, of course, you have this explosion. So the pressure started going up, surging up tremendously towards the end, and it was too late. They couldn't do anything after that. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about is this cap assembly, which was finally used to plug around July 15th, almost 3 months after the disaster started. They introduced this containment cap on top of the blowout preventer and shut off the well using what is known as a static kill. There was a series of other steps which were taken, junk shot, top hat, and all that. I've skipped all of that. So the final thing which sealed the well was a relief well, which is done now. And the amount of oil which had come out was about 5 million barrels of oil, 5 million barrels of oil. And it's one of the largest disasters of this kind. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Satish. I've written out my comments because talking for just 10 minutes is very difficult for me. So, the Scientia series focuses on the positive consequences of failure, on the ways in which when things go wrong, we can learn from those mistakes and move forward far more effectively in meeting our ends. And my thesis is that the BP failure has provided us with that same opportunity right here and right now, but there's a very real likelihood that in this instance we are simply not going to hear the wake-up call. The Gulf Coast catastrophe is about many things. It's about corruption, about deregulation, about the claim that we have such complete understanding and command over nature that we can re-engineer it with a minimum of risk to the natural systems that sustain us. Above all, it's about our addiction to oil, our belief that cheap and abundant energy is the essential driver of economic growth. And so we have told the oil companies, go out there and get as much oil as you possibly can at the cheapest possible price. And lo and behold, things happen when you drill at 5,000 feet and then for another 18,000 feet further to get us oil out of the fragile planet on which we live. And it's clear that BP failed to take adequate precautions. We also saw from Satish here just a kind of a coming together of a perfect storm of failures one after another, but these kinds of things, of course, happen, and we're going to have some serious effort to make sure that accidents of this particular sort are much less likely to happen again. But it's clear that BP failed to take adequate precautions. The federal regulators made no effort to ensure that such precautions were being made. We have had a period in which the oil companies basically controlled the regulators that were supposed to control the oil companies. The Minerals Management Service, which oversees drilling in the Gulf, was beholden to the oil companies themselves, joined with them in minimizing the environmental risks of drilling, and had no requirements for any of the backup shutdown systems that are standard in most of the rest of the world. There was some hope that this spill might serve as a powerful reminder that we need politicians who believe in good government, because there are some jobs that only the government can do, among them effective insistence on minimum safety standards. We need effective government if America is going to succeed as we go forward. Moreover, there was a resurgence of hope among environmentalists that Congress and the president might finally be willing to not simply talk about tackling climate change, but to do something about it, or at least to be more susceptible to the pressure from activists pushing in that direction. Moreover, the very same time we experienced a remarkable summer, a long, hot summer, a summer from hell it's been described as, when the world baked and melted and flooded and burned in ways that are at least consistent with what scientists tell us we can expect from continual burning of fossil fuels and the global warming that results. Here's a partial listing I got from the website of the Environmental Defense Fund of some of the striking events, the tragic and ominous events of this summer. 10 U.S. states had their hottest summer on record. All but 7 states were above normal. Summer nighttime heat records were set in 37 states during the period between June and August. The June to August global land surface temperature was the warmest ever on record, surpassing the previous record that was set in 1998. For only the 3rd time in the satellite record and the 3rd time in the last 4 years, the Arctic sea ice extent fell below 1.9 million square miles. The Arctic sea ice volume, the extent and thickness of the Arctic ice, reached the lowest level ever recorded. A record Russian heat wave caused massive wildfires and drought and may have killed up to 15,000 people, cost the Russian economy $15 billion, and destroyed 1/3 of the Russian grain crop. Devastating floods inundated 1/5 of Pakistan, drove millions from their homes, and led to the death of more than 1,600 people. Hundreds of walruses on Alaska's North Slope were stampeded to death when they beached themselves on land because there was no sea ice floes available to them. This year's extreme heat is causing only the 2nd known global bleaching of coral reefs. In oceans from Thailand to Texas, in the waters off the Philippines, 95% of the corals have died this year. Something real is happening on this planet, and I think most of us understand that that's the case. But even if you don't believe in global warming, there are compelling reasons for this nation to cut back on the piles of money that we are sending to some of the most dangerous and worst regimes in the world, to clean up our air, for God's sakes, to stimulate whole new industries of clean technologies. We're falling further and further behind the Chinese and the Germans in building the technologies of the 21st century in terms of the energy systems that we will need. And to stimulate and develop the new blue-collar jobs in energy conservation, retrofitting of homes with rooftop collectors, double glazing of windows, turbine manufacturing that will provide the critically needed kinds of blue-collar jobs that cannot be outsourced, that can provide real opportunities for the middle class and the working class of America. And yet, despite all of these powerful, in-your-face reminders of the unsustainability of our current practices, all the political energy this year seems to be on the far right, with its single-minded, simplistic call to shrink government in all areas and to cut taxes, while at the same time, of course, we're going to cut deficits and balance the budget. Hardly a prescription for moving us forward as a nation. The Tea Party movement would never have gained the traction that it has were it not for the fact that we are indeed in the midst of a very serious economic downturn, the worst this nation has experienced since the Great Depression. Here are some findings from our 2010 survey of the Houston area. The official unemployment rates, by the way, in Harris County, Texas, in 2007 were 4.1%. The unemployment rate grew to 6.3% in 2009 to 8.5% today. We asked people in our surveys, did you have any difficulty buying the groceries to feed your family? 1/4 of the respondents in our survey said they had difficulty buying the groceries to feed their family during the past year. The unemployment rate is 8.5 here. It's not at least 9.8% as it is in the nation as a whole, or 14.6% in Michigan, but it's very serious and very real. And it's impacted the Houstonians' views of the world. The proportion of area residents saying that things have been getting better for them financially over the past few years declined from 40% in 2008 to 32% in 2009 to just 20% in this year's survey. That percentage, 20% only, saying that things have been getting better financially in their lives, is lower than it has ever been in 29 years of surveys. At the depths of the recession in 1986, 87, that percentage never fell below 31%. 20% today only think things are getting better in their lives. The proportion who thought that they would be better off 3 or 4 years down the road dropped from 58% in 2008 to 52% in 2009 to 48% in 2010. And perhaps most compelling of all, the numbers who believe that their own standard of living would eventually be higher than that of their parents declined from 72% when we asked that question in 2008 to 57% in this survey this year. Deep concern about, obviously, where we're going, what the future of America is going to be, and not surprisingly, a growing resistance to any new initiatives that might entail more expenses or higher taxes or higher prices. Asked if they were in favor or opposed to requiring utilities to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases, even if this means that electricity rates will rise. In 2007, 66% were in favor. Right? Even if it means utility rates will rise. This year, that was true of only 48%. In 2008, 51% said the threat of global warming was a very serious problem. In this year's survey, only 37% said they thought it was a serious problem. Asked about this statement, strengthening pollution controls will result in too many restrictions on individuals and businesses. In 2007, 57% disagreed with that. No, it will not be too much control on business. Today, only 47% disagreed. Not a lot of important signs here of support for bold initiatives to address the critical environmental and planetary challenges that we face. Failure can sometimes serve us well, encourage us to try a new approach, help us move toward wisdom, and make us stronger. It does not look as if any of these positive outcomes will result from the many failures reflected in the BP Deepwater disaster that we're discussing today. Thank you.
Okay, that gives me quite a challenge. Let's talk about scale. Whenever people talk about energy, they talk about very interesting programs like the Baker Institute is working on with Rob Stein to look at weatherizing homes in the city of Houston. Great program. But our U.S. oil import bill is the equivalent in a terawatt-hour means of 8 times the current nuclear plants we have in this country running 24 hours a day. We have 103 plants. So that means if we were going to come up with a source to replace fossil energy, we would need to have the equivalent of, I don't know, we'd have to have 900 nuclear plants in this country instead of 100. And you have to understand the scale of what I'm talking about when you think about the question of should we or shouldn't we be drilling, right? Because people have emotional, religious feelings about whether we should or shouldn't be drilling, and they don't understand the scale of what happens when they flick the switch in their house and an invisible thing comes on. And if I were to take a survey in here, how many of you think when you flick the switch in your house, the electricity you get comes from natural gas? Raise your hand if you think it comes from natural gas. Raise your hand if you think it comes from coal. Okay, that's not too bad. Okay? Raise your hand if you think it comes from wind. Yeah, if you signed up. Okay. All right. So you're actually a pretty educated audience, so I'm impressed. So let's talk about the politics of drilling in the United States. The reality is that we had a major accident in the 1960s in Santa Barbara, California. And it was on a platform that was, when I tell you the platform was on the beach, the platform was on the beach. And you could go to Huntington today and see the platform on the beach. It's still there, right? So the structure that Satish is describing, you would have to get in a helicopter and fly how many hours? About an hour from Houston to see it, right? Some of the other platforms we're talking about 3 or 4 hours away. It takes 30,000 supercomputers to control the process that BP was trying to control, right? So I agree with Steve that we're talking about unbelievable technology. But where I disagree is on this question about whether or not we should cease to do something just because it involves advanced engineering. Raise your hand if you're here today and you're a student at Rice and you're in the engineering department. Okay, that's not as high a number of hands as I was hoping for. Okay. Right. Okay, so here's what I would say. Government cannot regulate a problem if there are not people in government who are people of science, right? So if you vote for someone who was a businessman or was a policy analyst like myself, or was just a staffer on the Hill and became very sophisticated, or was the son of a famous politician, and then he gets appointed to be the head of the MMS, or the Department of Interior, and he is going to make up regulations, and he could not pass an engineering class here at Rice, you're not going to have a good result, right? And so since I'm from the other side, well, actually, I have a lot of people, obviously, from my side of campus because I didn't get enough hands from the engineering department, right? The point is that people in science need to go into policy. Not everybody can be in science. Some people who are in science need to actually go into policy because if they don't, then there's no human being who can evaluate whether BP really was at fault or not at fault, what would be the science of preventing them from being at fault. And so the idea that the industry was self-regulating, well, I'm not sure I 100% agree with that. I mean, but the point is, if the people who are working for the MMS do not have to come to Rice every 4 years to learn what Satish is learning because he continues to do research in this subject, then how could they possibly regulate an industry that does R&D every day, all day? So just the structure of how we think about regulating science in this country is just completely incorrect because no one in this country actually goes into science. if they do go into science and get a PhD, they don't go into government service, or of course Manik is here and he did go into government service, but most people don't go into government service. And this lack of interest in going into government service is, in my view, the key problem of technological failure. Now, I had a very interesting experience, which I will confess to all of you. I went on National Public Radio the week before the BP Horizon disaster, and I was on with a very green, left-wing environmental journalist from the Washington Post, and she explained that we can't drill anywhere in the United States because it's just too dangerous. We have to stop using oil. But remember, I just explained to you about how many nuclear plants that is. That's like pretty dangerous too. And we can talk about how many windmills that would be. Peter could probably do that calculation for you. But I mean, we're talking about a lot of energy that has to be produced. And at the time, I happened to know the statistics for accidents in Gulf of Mexico, and the statistics were minuscule. We had not had a major accident in 30 years of drilling, right? And the spill rate was something like 100 barrels a year or 1,000 barrels a year. And so this woman is talking about the dangers, the dangers, the dangers. And of course, I, not being able to see the future, am quoted on NPR as saying, listen, our spill rate is really low. The companies have these incredible technologies. They have these blowout preventers that would, solve the problem if there was an accident. And of course, now I have to go back on NPR a week later and say the opposite, right? But I don't think the message is really as technically negative as people are thinking. And that is because for every technical problem, I'm an eternal optimist. There is a technical solution. And so the thing that I found the most discouraging, okay, I got it. We didn't regulate the oil companies well enough in the Gulf of Mexico. There wasn't anybody in the government who could even have a serious conversation with them about what that regulation should be, right? Had I known that they didn't have a technology for handling a blowout, I would have been on NPR saying we need to force them to make this technology. But even I, who watched the industry closely, just assumed they had a technology. I was shocked to find out that they had only a prevention technology and not a post facto, I had a blowout technology, right? And so now I have to go back on NPR radio 100,000 times and say, the industry needs a blowout technology. Now, everybody in this room, well, maybe not everybody in this room, because there might be 2 or 3 people in this room who've actually worked for an oil company. Most people just say, these companies are evil, right? They don't care whether they have a spill or not. Tony Hayward didn't make that any better by saying it's just a small drop of oil in a giant ocean. And he did a lot of damage to the industry. But it's a serious industry. The diagrams that Satish put up there on the map are as complex and difficult to do as if we invited NASA here to come and show us the thing they're going to land on Mars. I mean, it is just that complicated. And I might argue, with no offense to NASA, that it's more complicated because when they go to the moon, they're landing on rock, right? We kind of have all this knowledge about the gravity or lack thereof. We know how to measure that. We can put somebody down at the Space Center who's 5 years old in a gravity-less chamber, right? But there is so little knowledge about the seabed floor, right? Even the most top experts who work on the seabed floor, it's just a very poorly understood area of science, or it's just an area of science where there could be incredibly more knowledge, right? And so I was actually pretty impressed. I'm shocked and amazed that they were able to plug this well at all, because in Australia they weren't able to, just a year before. Well, they did a relief well, but they never did anything temporary to plug the well. And it was not in this deep as water, okay? And also, within 3 months, all the largest American companies announced that they'd learned what they'd learned trying to help BP for 3 months, and they're spending their own money to develop a technology to shut the well after a blowout within 3 days. And I believe in my heart that a company that could figure out how to drill in 10,000 feet of water can come up with that system. They will come up with that system. And when they announced that system, I got hundreds of media calls asking me about the trick that the oil companies were playing on the public to avoid regulation. And I have to tell you, I won't make it altruistic. Every oil company in the United States lost 30% of their value of their capital share price on Wall Street because of what happened with BP, even though they had done nothing wrong. So why wouldn't they spend $1 billion making this technology? Because who would want that to happen to them? And so the industry did make this terrible error. That is the failure. They made this terrible error of focusing only on prevention. And I'm sure many of them knew that the blowout preventers had a 50-50 record, right? But it was always like, well, it won't happen to me, right? And, if you were Chevron, it didn't happen to you. So, why would you change what you're doing? It's 30 years, you're not having an accident, right? But now that they know, there's no reason to believe that they wouldn't come up with a technology that would work to stop this kind of thing in 3 days. And I believe that they'll have the engineering to do it. They say 2 years. I think they'll have it in 2 years. So the question of leadership is this. In the whole story, and this isn't, because I'm pro-oil industry, because some of you have heard me give a lecture in the exact opposite direction. In the whole story of leadership, where BP showed no leadership, the MMS showed no leadership. President Obama didn't fly there the first day, second day, or third day. He didn't fly there at all until finally, people on TV started saying, hey, how come the president's not going there, right? 4 chairmen of large corporations stood up and said, we made a mistake. We're going to spend our money coming up with the technology to solve this failure. And nobody in this country applauded them. Nobody praised them. They didn't get any good PR. Nobody invited them on TV to talk about why they're doing that. It was a blip in the news like it didn't happen at all. When Chase Manhattan Bank and all these banks, or Citibank maybe is a better example, or Lehman Brothers and all these banks lost 30% of your pension, did anybody come on TV and tell you they could create a derivative product to solve it? No. Did anybody go to jail? No. Did any of them step down? No. I mean, at least BP took their chairman out, right? So here you have a case where the industry actually showed leadership, actually responded, and the polling would show that we hate them even more than we did before because one company didn't act responsibly, right? And I find that sort of a tragedy because when you talk about failure, right, the point about failure is not that it's a problem to fail. I'm standing here in front of you today, Peter Hartley will get a kick out of this, because I flunked the midterm that is the equivalent of 211 at Princeton. And now no longer being able to major in economics, I had to think quickly of a second major, which I picked, which was Arabic, right? Then, of course, I wound up doing well in economics, so it wasn't a problem. But my point to you is that, from every failure can come a success, right? And I see the industry coming out of this failure with a success. Because until someone here at Rice comes up with something that can create the same amount of energy as 900 nuclear plants, I don't see how we not drill. Unless you all want to stop driving and you're all willing to sit at night without lights. So I'll leave that controversial statement for the discussion period.
So actually, the 800 plants would replace imports only.
Only imports.
Imports, actually, not the total.
Yes, it would be twice as many if we just didn't want to use oil at all.
Oh,
Looks like it's coming. Maybe.
displays. Detect display. There we go. There we go. Who's from? There we go. All right. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so as Professor Grandy mentioned in the introduction, I'm going to try to move on to some sort of policy issues, perhaps a little bit more abstract, but probably nothing as much as what Simon's going to talk about. He's going to take it another level up in terms of abstraction. And part of the idea is maybe to give us some introduction to some other things you're going to discuss, I guess, in other talks in the series. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is sort of environmental policy in general, some of the issues, some way that economists think about environmental policy. And it's going to introduce some issues that I think Simon's going to pick up on. So basically, the approach is the way economists think about environmental policy is that we look for policies that are going to increase the efficiency of resource allocation. And what we mean by that is policies where the expected benefits we believe are likely to outweigh the expected costs. And of course, one thing this does is it ignores distributional effects. So who pays, who benefits and who pays. And I thought that Steve may have talked about this, but he didn't actually. I suppose he did indirectly. But the sociologists, of course, focus on the issue of who benefits and who pays, and there's a whole sort of subject of environmental justice. So economists, usually we just sort of add up the costs and benefits and don't worry about who's actually paying and who's benefiting. And the idea is, though, that we want to introduce policies that are going where the expected benefits are going to outweigh the expected costs. Now, from an economic perspective, the basic problem with or the basic reason why we have environmental problems is that important resources like clean air and clean water aren't really owned by anyone, and therefore you don't have to pay anything to use them. And because you don't have to pay anything to use them, what happens is that those resources get overused and abused. All right? So normally, if you had to pay to use them, the cost of using them would, of course, be included in the prices of goods and services. And so every time you consume something which to produce that good involved polluting the air, let's say, or polluting the water, so you used up the clean air or the clean water, the cost of that resource would be included in the price of the product. And so the consumer would automatically be paying for using up the environmental resources. And so we'd have an incentive to economise on their use, just like we have an incentive to economise on the use of other scarce resources like labour, capital, land, etc., water and so forth. So the big problem, though, is that because you don't have to pay to use those resources, the cost of using them is not reflected in prices, and therefore people tend to overuse them. And we end up with overexploitation and inefficient outcomes. A related problem to that is that the benefits of correcting these externalities, we call them, or these problems, this overexploitation, the benefits of correcting that typically accrue to many people at once. So if we clean up the air, everyone who's breathing the air benefits. Clean up the water, everyone who's drinking the water or using it for recreation purposes and so on benefit. And so the overall benefits can therefore be very, very large. However, when we actually carry out a cost-benefit analysis, even though the benefits to any one individual is small, the overall benefits are large, it doesn't mean, nevertheless, that the efficient level of pollution is zero. Typically, when you balance out the costs and benefits, what you find is that you want to go to the point where the marginal benefits from correcting the externality just match the marginal costs. So typically that's going to be a non-zero level because there are costs involved in terms of using other resources as well as benefits associated with cleaning up the environment. Now, moving a little bit along towards sort of what some of the things Simon's going to talk about, one of the big problems in implementing this conceptual framework is that there's often a lot of uncertainty about both the costs and the benefits. Economists have invented various ways to try to handle this problem. One of the critical issues, of course, and Amy actually alluded to this, which is that often the firms know a lot more about the costs of control than the government regulators do. And so it's often very difficult to know exactly how much it's going to cost to correct the problem. What we need to do, typically the experts in an industry are not really going to be working for the government regulator. I mean, if you're really, really good at the job, you know a lot about it, you probably earn a lot more. So getting back to Amy's point about the scientists not working for the government, often you get a lot more working for the companies. And so the regulatory authorities often really don't know as much about the true costs of control. So actually environmental economists have devised methods of mechanisms, policy mechanisms, which actually give firms an incentive to reveal some of their costs. So these involve sort of adjustments to taxes and tradable permit schemes. And so in response to the taxes and the permits, what the firms actually do is reveal their costs. Of course, a lot of the clever things that people come up with often aren't so practical when it comes to practical implementation. So thus far, actually, not many governments really have picked up on those ideas. In practice, policies have usually been restricted to three kinds of mechanisms. One is sort of direct controls, where the government actually just specifies you're going to use certain kinds of technology. A second, though, is a tax on pollution output. And the third one is a tradable permit. And if we think about this in the context of uncertainty, one of the things that economists have pointed out, really, with the fact that we've got uncertainty about the costs and benefits, so I have here, being an economics talk, I've got to have my supply and demand kind of curves. And so what we have here is a picture, on the along the vertical axis I've got an E for emissions, so this is the amount of pollution being emitted. And on the vertical axis we've got prices or costs. And this upward sloping curve is the marginal damage associated with emissions. That would be the marginal damage that everyone's experiencing, let's say, from the emissions into the air or the water. And the downward sloping curve represents the marginal costs of control. So, of course, the more the firms are allowed to emit, the lower the marginal costs of control. And the problem is here we have, it's okay. So you mean I should use this rather than maybe that's a good idea. So the idea is that this marginal cost of control is uncertain because we don't really know, the firm's costs. Now, what we can do is if we use a quantitative control and we set it so that we think that the marginal cost of control was the bottom curve, or here, what we do is we'd set E star, and the point is, of course, if the true cost is actually higher, we make a loss, and the loss is measured by this little triangle. Alternatively, if we set a tax, we can also make a loss. So this is the loss from the tax, and the yellow triangle is the loss from the fee. Now, we can think about two different situations, one where the marginal cost of control is really flat, and the other one where it's really steep. And what this says is basically that if this marginal cost of control is very, very flat, but we don't know exactly what it is, what we should really be doing is setting a fee. It's like a tax. On the other hand, if the marginal cost of control is very steep, but we don't really know what we're doing, what we should really be doing is setting the quantity. So this gives you a sort of a framework for thinking about when it is we want to have a pollution tax versus when you want to have tradable permits. So sometimes, it's not, economists have talked about, so in the US we have tradable permits for SO2, but for a lot of other pollution we have a tax. So the point is, in some cases you might want to use a tax, other cases a permit. The critical factor is the relative slopes of these supply and demand curves. So I guess what I'm trying to give you a flavour of is that a lot of work has been done thinking about how you would optimally design policies in the face of some of these uncertainties. With regard to the expected benefits from pollution control, the focus is often on illness or death associated with the pollution. And it turns out actually that the federal government, all governments around the world, do have, including in their planning and policy formulation process, they have to put a value on human life, and they have to put a value on health effects. And it doesn't apply just to environmental policy, it applies to all sorts of other policies. So you're thinking about, for example, building highways. You could engineer the highway so that you more likely to avoid accidents. That has a benefit, but because there's a cost involved, it's going to be much more expensive. You know, the extreme example would be in the city, we could have every intersection involving an underpass and an overpass, so you wouldn't have any collisions at the intersection, but it'd be a very, very expensive way to build the roads. So it's a fact of life that we have to trade off these kind of the chance of the loss of life with the costs involved. And the same thing applies to something like FDA, so you're regulating drugs. You know, on the one hand, you let a bad drug through, it's going to lead to some loss of life or whatever. But on the other hand, if you don't let a good drug through, that also will have costs, right? So the good drug doesn't get on the market as soon as it would otherwise. So to make this kind of trade-off, the FDA has to have a value of human life. And of course, the EPA also has to have a value of human life and and a value of health effects. And actually, it turns out people who've looked at the federal government in the US, the implicit value of human life embedded in policy varies from 1 million to 10 million. And actually, you can imagine the department actually where the value of a human life is lowest is the Department of Transportation. The FDA is in the middle and the EPA is actually at the top. So the way we set environmental controls, it's as if we value a human life 10 times as much as when we're deciding on how to spend transportation dollars. Now, for many environmental policies, the distribution of costs and benefits may be very asymmetric. So you can have extremely large, disastrous outcomes. So one way of thinking about that is instead of using costs and benefits, we think about in terms of an option. It's like a financial option, like a stock option. And you want to view environmental measures as an option to present the worst outcomes may actually be preferable in that kind of circumstance. Another problem we face, and I'm sort of moving on to some of these issues which Simon's going to take up, is that a lot of environmental policy, irreversibility is a problem. So in particular, we're thinking about preserving biodiversity. Once a species is lost, it's lost forever. Well, maybe. I guess they're trying to bring back some species with genetic engineering and chimera species and so forth. But I guess there's a case of a Japanese snipe or something, which they managed to bring back by interbreeding with a Chinese snipe. But cheating. And I guess people are trying to work on trying to bring back various extinct animals, looking at their specimens and trying to get the DNA and so forth. But that has risks too. That probably has risks too. But roughly speaking right now, once a species is gone, it's gone. So some of the benefits of policy may also be environmental policy may also be very subjective and very difficult to measure. So if we think about air pollution, so it has health effects, so we can try to measure that by looking at how much people are willing to spend on improving their health, or how much we're willing to spend in other ways on public health measures and so forth, which is the sort of thing that economists will do. Also, but there are other kinds of costs. So an example is power plants in the Four Corners area of the USA were putting out lots of pollution which was affecting the Grand Canyon. And so environmental controls were actually put on those plants. Even though there weren't many people around to breathe the polluted air, there were lots of people who were complaining about the vistas in the Grand Canyon being spoiled. And so it's not just health effects, there are other effects, and we need to measure those as well. And basically the way people do that is with surveys. So not quite the Houston area survey, but they're called contingent valuation surveys. We try to measure the subjective value. And I say here they're controversial. Of course, a lot of this stuff is actually controversial. All right, so I think my time's about running out, so I'll just make a few remarks about the BP accident. We learned a few things about the cost of control and damages of offshore drilling from this. One is the importance of incentives. So I would say, Amy sort of focused on technology, but I think the other thing here is important is incentives, because from the people I've spoken with in the industry, BP apparently had very strong incentive payments for their engineers and so forth to bring projects in under cost. But they didn't have the same kind of bonus payments for bringing them in with a better safety record. Whereas some of the other oil companies did have much stronger payments for safety. And so I think it's not, there's one pointer here, that it's not just a matter of technical capability, that incentives matter in the way you structure payments. Another thing is, I think with these technological examples, accidents often reveal bugs, I'm saying in the technology using the sense of computer bugs, that are not revealed before because that exact sequence of actions didn't occur. So Satish went through the number of sequential things that had to happen. I don't know anyone who's written a computer program, often it works great, until you feed in a new set of parameter values and all of a sudden the thing falls over and blows up because you've never been through that part of the program before and you didn't find the bug. So that's part of what happens in some of these kind of accidents. We didn't have that exact sequence. And of course, once we get into talking about computers, once you get into computer control, it's made many technologies difficult to monitor and assess. And one of Simon and my colleagues has a son who's a white hat hacker, and he's employed actually by people like the airline companies. So one of the airline companies employed him to try to figure out how to hack into a plane and see if you can take over control of the plane from his seat. And actually he did. Pretty scary. So they need to, the airplane manufacturers need to improve their computer system so you can't do that. I mean, his seat on the plane, I'm saying. Yeah. So going in through the AV system, he was able to control the whole plane.
Was he a good pilot?
His job was just to hack in and show that he could take control of the plane, which he was able to do. So, I mean, a lot of these cases, when the equipment's manufactured, a lot of these very complicated situations, we may not know a lot of the problems. The other thing that's been pointed out here, I think there was growing complacency when accidents didn't happen, or when they did, in the case of deep water drilling, the blowout preventer actually saved the day at the end of the day. So I think there was growing complacency, a lot of operators in the Gulf. They thought they drilled thousands of wells, the accident hadn't happened, and then in cases where there had been a problem, the blowout preventer had worked. Another thing we found was that there actually were new bacteria that were discovered that survived in much deeper, colder water, which no one knew about until the accident. So that's another kind of surprise. Some responses to the accident. As Amy mentioned, the oil companies have moved to put together a response protocol and equipment. So from that apparatus that was put on the well in July, they're actually developing a new piece of equipment so that if the blowout preventer fails, you can actually, they'll have the equipment ready to go and you can put it on top and use that to, don't have to drill a relief well, you'll be able to use that piece of equipment, which is basically modelled on the piece of equipment that BP in the end used. But they didn't really have that available, but now they know, and apparently they're working on developing that. Some people in the industry have also called for better checks on the operational status of blowout preventers, recognising that an accident damages the industry as a whole. And as I've mentioned, at the same time, government inspectors likely to know much less about the technology, which means I think in the end we do have to rely on a certain amount of industry regulation. And some in the industry have called for a checklist of actions to be taken on drilling platforms, but others have questioned whether a checklist is a good idea. And with that, I'll hand over to Simon. I think he's going to take up some of this. This one's yours. Oh, what you mean? You just control that. You're right. Commando.
And then just to scroll down.
Oh, you can do it there?
No, how are you scrolling down?
With that little arrow.
This one?
Key? This one.
That one, okay. Okay, I'm Simon Grant, also from the Department of Economics, and I actually want to focus, as Peter said, a little bit more at an abstract level, because Peter was talking about expected benefits and expected costs. I think we're all sort of familiar with what we mean by benefits and costs. Perhaps that word expected, what is actually underlying that? Actually, one economist could describe this, that there's a lot of dead bodies buried there, and so let's do a bit of excavation. The standard theory in economics and many of the other social sciences, when we talk about uncertainty, we actually formally are going to be representing this by a state space. And by that, I really mean all possible contingencies. It's a full and complete model, so everything that is conceivable should be actually included in that. Each state is mutually excludable from other states, and together they actually incorporate everything that is germane to the situation. And so you associate a course of action that BP might be undertaking, whether it's to build the well, how it's to operate it, who it's to employ. We can think of that as an action, and that's going to actually map from these states, these choices by nature, to consequences. So you can think of this as if when we're making a decision under uncertainty, essentially we're having to gamble, we're having to play a game, we're playing a game against nature. At the time when we have to make our choice, unfortunately, we don't know what the future is. As Amy said, if only she knew when she was speaking at NPR that 1 week earlier that there was going to be a blowout, she may have sort of tailored her comments accordingly. So things happen. So nature is choosing from its set of states, and BP is having to make its choice of actions. The theory normally makes enough assumptions about our preferences over our actions so that it's as though we can assign probabilities. So these are numbers between 0 and 1, and they all sum to 1. So it's as if we think nature's playing according to a strategy. She's going to assign a particular probability to that state. And that's called the subjective prior. And then the expected utility rule. This also greatly simplifies our way, and we get to the expected benefits and costs that Peter was talking about. Our preferences are and are formulated so that we can actually assign a little utility number to these consequences. I guess for the case of BP, it'll be some amount of money, but it's going to be sort of representing everything that it sort of cares about. And then we can rank that action. We multiply the probability by the utility of that consequence, sum across all the possible states, and that's what's called, in this case, would be the expected profit, or the expected benefit minus the expected costs, and we look for that action which maximizes those. So it's a beautiful, elegant, and complete theory. Alas, lots of things that happen to us, unfortunately, don't sort of seem to accord with it. And I think this is actually one of the best quotes that Rumsfeld ever said. I think it was very unfairly pilloried for it. Perhaps the text or the way that he said it is a little bit clumsy, but the key is this idea of unknown unknowns. And this is, I think, which Steve was alerting to. Perhaps we need to be a little bit more a little less conceited that we actually think that our models and our theories about the underlying nature of the world is that complete that we actually know everything, or act as if we do know everything. So ultimately, lots of decisions we have to make, and this has been a recurring thing amongst all the speakers, involve things that we really actually don't really understand what all the consequences will be. We don't really actually understand what the causal relationships are. And yet we've got to make decisions. We've got to make these trade-offs that Peter talks about. You may sort of regard and think that it's repugnant that we put a money value on the value of a life, whether it's the Department of Transportation's $1 million or the Environmental Protection Agency's $10 million, but we're going to have to be making those trade-offs. I'm not going to be there. I'm not going to have such a problem with that. I actually think that for good policy to making decisions, we have to make those types of assessments. But what I am going to be worried about is let's not treat these probabilities too precisely. So the trouble is, I think, or rather what is endemic in these types of situations is we can never consider all the possibilities. No. And so we should be aware of that unawareness. And so that, I think we have to be a little bit more humble in the way we sort of approach these things. And so we can't use our sort of complete theories. We could get very sophisticated and perhaps sort of say, well, we have one probability belief coming from one person. We might get a whole range of experts and get all their best estimates what the underlying probabilities might be. And then you come to the problem, well, how do I aggregate those expert opinions? One way may be I'll just weight them by the degree of confidence I have in that particular expert, and then we're back to one probability distribution, and essentially we're doing the same calculations as we did before. You might want to be prudent and sort of say, well, let's consider each action and let's handicap it, let's evaluate it according to the least favorable of those expert opinions, and then that might at least make us a little sort of bit prudent that somebody sort of thinks that this low probability event has some higher degree of likelihood, and we'll take that into account when we're evaluating that particular course of action. But I think way that actual people learn is from our past experience. And the thing about past experience, as I said, as we've learned in the Gulf, this wonderful safety record up until that blowouts at the Deepwater horizon, we're often going to be surprised, and in a sense, we should expect to be surprised. We've been surprised in the past. It's reasonable that we should be expected to be surprised in the future. And unfortunately, it seems to be endemic in this area. Actions involving environmental risk are often characterized by unfortunate surprises. Not everything is unfortunate. I would argue, maybe this is a little bit self-serving, being a professor or employed in a university, who our job is to do exploration discovery, but I would say exploration discovery may be characterized by favorable surprises. And there I would actually say there's added benefit to these types of undertaking clear sky research, which is going to be very difficult for us to actually predict in ways of just saying, as if we had, here's a probability that we're going to have this great new discovery. Let's invest up to the point where the marginal benefit of that last dollar invested is equal to the marginal social cost of doing so. And of course, some actions may not be subject to surprises, and I would say that really sort of classifies these three types of domains. In this domain, yes, let's apply the well-known model of expected benefits versus of expected costs, because we have a good and relatively complete understanding of what these underlying probabilities might be from the weight of evidence going back, perhaps because this is something that we've analysed for many years. While new undertakings, whether we're building a nuclear plant in a place where there's a earthquake danger, or whether we're undertaking drilling in deep water, which we haven't had less experience with, maybe we shouldn't be so confident just the fact that there hasn't been any spills to date, that means that we won't be surprised later on. And as you probably sort of tell your kids who are invariably conservative about things, you get them out to do new and different activities because you expect them to be surprised favorably to find something that they might have a talent for, or something they have an interest for that they didn't know about before. This, I think, sort of brings us to the precautionary principle. There are many definitions of it. This is one I got from Wikipedia. The wing spread declaration from a conference held in 1998 with various academics and environmentalists. It says, where an activity raises threats of harm to the environment or human health, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically, even if we don't have that precise understanding of what the relationship between the underlying states of the world and the actions we're taking. But in order to make this operational, it seems to me you have to have some sort of surprise-free default option. As excuse me. So the heuristic, I think this might be sort of seeming to suggest, is avoid actions that are subject to unfavorable surprises. But if we did that literally, as Amy suggested, you might have to then stop turning on all your lights. We have to sort of close down all the power plants, or we have to immediately sort of cease oil production, because we've seen that this is subject to unfavorable surprises. So I think that's sort of actually too strong. So in work with one colleague at the University of Queensland, we're trying to think about sort of how we can try and sort of reason about our unawareness, but not have such a stark result which might actually be too conservative, lead to too much inaction. The type of thing we have in mind is it requires some inductive judgments to the form, some proposition about unfavorable surprises is more likely than not. In this case, you might think, in order for it to be operational, we might think that we have to have sort of some type of fallback strategy that bounds the losses at some particular level. Then, the heuristic we're sort of suggesting, a modified precautionary principle, avoid that actions that are subject to unfavorable surprises unless the no surprise is more likely than not and yields expected benefits greater than C. So what we have in mind is you can undertake some type of action, but there is a fallback, or there's a pull-out option that can actually bound your losses. And when you're undertaking this, yes, you know you're in a domain of unfavorable surprises, but you'll be undertaking either environmental studies or some type of other technical developments, which might actually, you think, given your inductive experience, is more likely than not will actually reveal there won't be any unfavorable surprises. But should there be unfavorable surprises, you have a chance to bail out. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the way to go, but what it alludes to, I think, is thinking of the precautionary principle as a procedural rule, rather than working with a pseudo precision of precise beliefs and working with a particular expected benefit number minus an expected cost. Let's be a little bit sort of more flexible. But it's not part of the formal risk analysis, but it actually sets the conditions, the domain in which we think that risk analysis actually makes a lot of sense because we have confidence in those models. But in individual decisions, it's a heuristic that gives us some idea about how to approach this area where we might be facing unknown unknowns and in particular unfavorable surprises. And I don't have time to go through it here, but in joint decisions, both Amy and Peter were talking about how we have a lack, perhaps, of expertise in the government area if we're going to be trying to involve regulation. I would say then that what's a burden of proof on those proponents. Those proponents who are suggesting you take actions in these areas which are subject to unfavorable surprises, then there should be a higher level burden of proof than to convince you that this is going to be an activity which won't lead to these unfavorable surprises, won't lead to perhaps disastrous or deleterious effects. I'll leave it there.
We could obviously have a terrific dialogue among the panelists, but instead we're going to take questions from the audience. I have two volunteers who have microphones. So if you would raise your hand, we're going to go to a less formal question and answer session outside here with refreshments. When are we doing that, Susan?
Pardon?
When are we going out? 5:30?
Let's go out in about 10 minutes.
So we'll go
And I
out
want to say, if students are leaving and there's a course sign-up sheet, where are those sign-up sheets? All right, so maybe why don't you give that to me and we'll get that down front. Anybody that hasn't signed up can do it before you leave.
Okay. Melinda?
I'm sort of curious about your last presentation that sort of implies a theoretical bottom line of risk. And I'm following up on Steve's presentation, having read, I guess a couple of months ago, a report in the Houston Chronicle that two eminent scientists were predicting humans would be extinct within 100 years. And the director of NASA's Institute for Space Studies says if we go ahead and burn all the feasible fossil fuels, we will probably go through the same transition that Venus did, effectively sterilizing the planet. Of course, there's only a finite number of humans. Is that a finite cost in this sort of evaluation?
Yes.
Okay.
Jim? Anyone else?
I have the mic.
Okay.
The mic is working?
Yes.
Yeah. One of the things that was clearly revealed in this bill, and particularly in the testimony before the Congressional Committee, was that the major oil companies' plans for dealing with oil spills were what are called fantasy plans. They had no relationship to reality, and there are some technical problems that have no solution. For example, during the Cold War, they had the kids getting under their desk in case of nuclear attack. Clearly, there is no technical solution for nuclear attack that people were willing to pay the cost to undertake. So my concern is, with $4 billion, is that enough money to come up with a real plan in case of a major spill instead of a fantasy plan? Does a real plan actually exist?
Can we have
Yeah, I think Satish probably
Satish
has a more
first, but
educated opinion than I do.
Okay. I think your concern is rightly placed. The industry, even after this incident, they were able to cap it, of course, after 3 months of experimenting, and finally they stopped the spill and plugged the well. But I think the industry is grappling with this disaster in a way that I think it's clear it was not systematic. I mean, they had no plan. In fact, the plans they had submitted were, as you said, fantasy. And finally, when they faced reality, they started waking up. And I think the silver lining in this is that hopefully the industry will understand that the type of activity that they're doing is so risky that they have to place a right amount of regulation in place so that checks and balances are in position that in case an event like this starts developing. In fact, the thing about this is the event is so simple. They started observing these abnormal fluctuations of pressure earlier on in the day. In fact, they could have stopped all of this by just merely recognizing the fact that there is an event, it's called a kick in the oil industry, that is occurring. So this is a classic case of human and mechanical failure coming together, at the same time. So it's a complex set of tasks which have to be performed. And as Amy was mentioning, some of those tasks may not be even performed properly because the competent people are not in position to respond to such events. The response that they are planning to do, which is essentially the 4 large oil companies have come together and say, they're investing about $1 billion to come up with a response plan, is a good step forward. But I'm not sure that's adequate for an event in 10,000 feet. I mean, this was 5,000 feet. In 10,000 feet, there may be other challenges which may come into play, which they don't even have an answer for. I think this is where the government, the industry, as well as academia has to come together and look at this problem as a whole and come up with a solution. But I'm not sure whether this event is going to even lead to that. I really don't know.
Any other panelists want to follow up on that?
I was speaking to someone from BP who was genuinely really surprised. They said, but the blowout preventer didn't work. I think clearly the mindset in a lot of people in the industry was that at the end of the day, the blowout preventer is going to save them, but it didn't. But I think what they're doing now is going from the device that was actually installed by BP in the end. The industry is going to make another one of these devices that supposedly, if the blowout preventer doesn't work next time, you can have this thing ready to go. But the second thing is that there's been a lot of discussion. I've been speaking with some people from different companies who are talking about, I think I mentioned in my talk, talking about developing a checklist. And Simon and I had a discussion about this, and he might have something to say about it. But some of them were saying that, some people in the industry were saying that the checklist is of no value because you just go down and check off the items and so forth, and there's not really a genuine, that's not really a genuine constraint on forcing the companies to actually take actions that are going to make a difference. And I had an interesting discussion with Simon about that.
I just wanted, I mentioned to Peter that checklists actually are very popular in a number of industries, one of which where they developed was the airline industry. Early on, they had sort of very experienced pilots, and they found that they were, even with very experienced pilots, were having accidents, some fatal. And what they were working out was that there was complacency. And so what the beauty of the procedural rationality of a checklist is it makes you and the co-pilot go down, itemize, and make sure you don't forget things. Because as you become competent and as you become assured, sometimes you actually also become complacent. I didn't want to go there.
So the other thing I would say in terms of the industry, right, is, some of it's the incentive structure and some of it's regulation. So if Peter mentioned BP. BP was punished by Wall Street in the 80s and 90s for having the highest production costs in the industry. So of course the companies started focusing on how to lower their costs. That's one of the reasons they bought Amoco, because Amoco was a company that had low costs. They want to learn by buying them. But I think the point is really getting to Peter and Simon's framework, especially Simon's framework of his little diagram, is that you had an industry that had this matrix. And the matrix was, if I do the following checklist, because BP might not have had the checklist, but the other companies had checklists, and they did the checklist, and they didn't have an accident, right? So they thought they were in a probabilistic situation that they could manage. So, I'm not in engineering. It's hard to know. The one thing I would say as a person at a university is I was at the first meeting, you'll appreciate this comment, Bob, I was at the first meeting between the oil companies and Rick Smalley, where they explained that nano didn't have any applications to them, right? And it just wasn't anything interesting or useful for them. And it was because they didn't know anything about nanotechnology. So I think we, as academics, right, have this huge responsibility. If the oil companies don't understand the seabed floor at 10,000 feet, and maybe they don't, because somebody got a PhD 20 years ago and it took them 20 years to get promoted to be in the position of authority to make a decision, right? Then someone needs to be explaining to that person why they need to come up and maintain their knowledge of the science. And I do find a reluctance in industry. In other words, you know, I'm coming here and I'm trying to talk you into investing in our research, and you're having difficulty understanding why listening to Jerry Dickens would have any relevance for what you do. And, you know, there is this sort of lack of intellectualism, right, that really needs to be weeded out. And I look at projects we're doing here at Rice, like RCEL, right, or some of the internships we offer at the Baker Institute or offered by Rebecca Richards-Cordum as opportunities to have our students be what Ken Kennedy used to call lifelong learners. In other words, I need to know 20 years from when I leave Rice or UT or, you know, Oklahoma, what I don't know anymore. And I see that as the system. We're having a program on systemic failure. That's the systemic failure. I mean, it could be that they can't come up with a technology, or it could be that they're going to do this technology that worked at 5,000 feet, and there's not going to be anybody intellectually enough to raise their hand and say, well, geez, is the water pressure and the seabed floor different at 10,000 feet, or is it different in pre-salt Brazil, or is it different in Australia than in Gulf of Mexico? And, you know, not enough people ask that question. And I see that issue on the policy side all the time, right? I have these assumptions about the market and what the market price is going to be, or I have some assumption about U.S. national interests, and I think that what's true today is going to be true in 20 years. I can't look forward 20 years, or something happened 50 years ago and I have no knowledge of it, so I don't even realize that I'm making the same stupid mistake we made 50 years ago, right? And it really comes from this, I wouldn't even call it complacency, it's this lack of knowledge about what I don't know, right? And to me, that's our role, right? Our role is to engage industry into understanding what they don't know.
One more question.
Yeah, just briefly.
Sorry.
Just on checklists, there's been big improvements in medical outcomes in surgeries when they've started to institute checklists, so there's something there. I wanted to ask you just if you could clarify the scale issue that you brought up in the beginning about the oil, and how much of that comes from offshore drilling as opposed to, you know, is that making a significant input into our energy usage in this country versus what we get from Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and so forth, or even domestically onshore?
So, you know, maybe it's 10 or 20%, but I think we need to look at that question in a different way. Are we offshoring our pollution to Nigeria, and is that morally sound? Right?
I agree, but...
Right, you know, so, yeah, well, you know, we can offshore all the pollution of our energy use to other countries. But, you know, do we think we're going to have good relations with other countries if we do that? Is that socially just, right? I mean, we're in the philosophy department, but I think if some of the people I know from English and humanities who work on environmental justice were here in this room, they would be, like, horrified to even think about that. And I think we need to think about that in a serious way, because we in the United States are 5% of the world's population, and we use 35% of the world's road transportation fuel. And that is shocking. I mean, if you think about what percentage is being manufactured around the world and where we're drilling, You know, it's just appalling to think of how much we use compared to everybody else. And whether anybody would, there's no discussion in this country to go into public transportation. Zero.
Could you join me in thanking our panelists, and then please join us outside for refreshments.
This program is protected by a copyright and may not be redistributed in whole or in part without the express written consent of Rice Digital Media Services.